interaction that I have with producers, consultants, fellow researchers, extension staff, and so on. So this morning, I'd like to give you a very general overview of the Prairie Crop Disease Monitoring Network's cereal rust risk forecasts. We've been doing this since 2018 as part of the Canadian Agricultural Partnership cluster, and then now with funding from a number of different funding agencies and producer groups. So we'll look at the cereal rust risk forecasts. Just like to quickly acknowledge my co-authors, and especially Ross Weiss, who's retired from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Saskatoon. Ross is an entomologist, and I've interacted with Ross over the last probably 25 to 30 years. So he's been a key person in terms of the cereal rust risk forecasts and specific components related to that. Before I get into the talk, again, I'd like to acknowledge the collaboration and mentorship of researchers, producers, industry colleagues, the indirect assistance of pathologists from the university, or from the USA, sorry, I was going to say University of Saskatchewan, and then, of course, the two funding agencies, and then the funders that you see here, and then the Wheat Initiative and Ream for inviting me to speak. So if we look at the Prairie Crop Disease Monitoring Network, the intention is that it will be a coordinated plant disease monitoring program focused on field crops. It's meant to keep Canadian farmers and the ag industry informed of crop disease issues in terms of highlighting what is out there, informing producers regarding issues, and also creating awareness regarding these issues and their effective management. And it's modeled after the very successful and long-running Prairie Pest Monitoring Network for insect pest species that was developed initially by Owen Olfert and is continuing on with Megan Van Koski and other colleagues like Jennifer Otani. Now, if we look at the objectives of the Prairie Crop Disease Monitoring Network, one of the primary objectives is to facilitate the development and delivery of these weekly cereal rust risk forecasts, and then issue those forecasts via, initially it was a blog that we had, and then Western Grains Research Foundation was kind enough to help support the development of a Prairie Crop Disease Monitoring website. And there's a QR code there that you can use to access that. And again, we're building on the efforts of colleagues previously. So especially in terms of insect pest species and diamondback moth movement from the States. And that was Ross Weiss, Owen Olfert, Julie Soroka, and Jennifer Otani. And then also some work that we did initially with Ross, Owen, and Julie back in the 70s, or the 2000s, I should say. 1970s. I was in high school or elementary school. So if we look at the Prairie region, to give you a bit of background, what are the main rust issues that we encounter? Well, typically stem rust can be an issue. Traditionally, it's more of a problem in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and has largely been managed over the last, let's say 50, 75 years using host resistance, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment or so. Leaf rust can also be a problem, again, mainly in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. We have observed it here in Alberta, and I'm sure, Reem, probably you have, where we see it very late in the growing season, typically in late July, maybe even into August. Stripe rust traditionally has been our main problem in the Western Prairie region, especially in Alberta, but also Western Saskatchewan. But now I think, Reem, with the emergence of some of these higher temperature ecotypes of stripe rust, it's now becoming more of an issue for central to eastern Saskatchewan and Manitoba. One other aspect of stripe rust that can be quite challenging is the fact that it will overwinter. So if you have movement from the spring crop onto the fall seeded crop, winter wheat crop, infection, disease development, and then you have a mild winter. That rust pathogen, that striped rust pathogen, can survive, and when the winter wheat crop starts regrowing the following spring, that pathogen can start sporulating again and then initiating epidemics in that winter wheat field as well as adjacent spring wheat fields. Now, the rusts historically have been a big problem, and and other disease issues such as the bunts. This is just I have a newspaper.com subscriptions. I'm the family genealogist, so I've been searching for various things related to family members, but I've also used it to look at articles based on or that deal with plant diseases. So certainly big issues with bunt in wheat, stinking smut in wheat, I guess probably be the same thing, and then stem rust in wheat in the Prairie region. And I do enjoy looking at family history and sometimes relating that to the area that I work in. And my grandfather and grandmother farmed in the Dalesford area of Saskatchewan. And in 1958, before I was born, they celebrated their 50th sort of anniversary of the founding of Dalesford, and they produced this little book. And reading through it, I came across references to stem rust. So in 1937, they had a severe drought, so a lot of crop loss, and they tried to salvage the crop that was there for feed for livestock. And then in 1938, they had a very significant stem rust epidemic, and any of the growers in the region that were using or growing Marquis wheat had almost a total crop loss. And that year, those who were fortunate enough to have seed of the new rust and drought resistant wheat Thatcher were rewarded in terms of managing that disease issue and not having impact. So in the past, it's been a significant issue. However, through the work of pathologists like Ream and colleagues at Morden and at the universities, and the work that all of our breeders have done over the last 75 years, we've tried to stay on top of the issue. And as part of our variety registration process, rusts are a priority 1 disease in both wheat, rye, and triticale and oat and barley. And the minimum desirable level of resistance in terms of candidate lines that are proposed for registration is an intermediate reaction, so moderately susceptible to moderately resistant. But really, most varieties carry a moderately resistant to resistant level of resistance. Just an example of that to point it out, here's the listing of cereal and flax varieties for 2025. And Radiant is one, an older variety that initially Ream, I think, probably had a more of an MR rating for stripe rust because of shifts in pathotype. It's more of a susceptible. It's also susceptible to leaf rust and stem rust. A few others, a newer variety is susceptible to stem rust. And then we have some other varieties like Pintail that have some moderate susceptibility to leaf and stem rust. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but this just shows you the varieties from the 2025 Seed Manitoba Guide. And you can see the 3 rusts here and the listing. So stem rust, the tendency is for most varieties to have an MR to an R resistant rating. Stripe rust, there are a few more, but the majority of varieties have probably an MR to an R rating. So resistance is a key tool in terms of managing this disease. And we're not complacent about it. And colleagues, again, like Ream and colleagues at Morden and the universities, spend a lot of time monitoring rust pathogen populations, pathotyping work, working with colleagues in the USA as well as elsewhere, trying to stay on top of shifts in virulence, and then working with breeders to incorporate more effective resistance genes. So certainly resistance can be a tool, but one of the issues that we see is, and that we worry about, at least I worry about, is a complacency in terms of some of these issues. For example, in stem rust, in the prairies, we haven't had huge epidemics probably since the 50s, for example, really severe epidemics. So the question is often, well, stem rust is not a problem. Why do we need to put effort and funding and resources into this issue when it's really not a problem? Well, it's not a problem because of ongoing efforts of pathologists and breeders, but there is a complacency there, and stem rust traditionally comes up through that Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska corridor into the central to eastern Prairie region, especially. However, there's some troubling signs on the horizon, and in looking at some of the work that Dr. Brueggemann and colleagues at Washington State University have done, they've identified some more novel virulence combinations in stem rust in the Pacific Northwest, where they have an alternative host, Oregon grape or Mahonia species. So that is a concern, because it only takes about a half a day for that rust spore to move from the Washington State, Oregon area into southern Alberta. So stem rust might be something that we want to keep an eye on in the future. Now, one thing that we often hear as pathologists working in disease resistance, well, we don't need to develop resistant varieties. We can simply spray our way out of a problem. And yes, certainly a very effective tool, but when it's used frequently within and between growing seasons, there is a risk of fungicide resistance. And you look at the UK and Europe and emerging issues in Australia, it's something that we're concerned about in other leaf diseases in cereals. And rust traditionally have been thought of as being a low risk for fungicide resistance development. But there's some recent research by a PhD student, Bohan Wee, who worked with Ream, as well as some articles from Richard Oliver and colleagues outlining that the risk associated with rust fungi may not be as low as we anticipate. So it's something to keep in mind in terms of an overall integrated approach to rust management in cereals. So if we look at cereal rust risk in a prairie perspective, cereal rust typically overwinter on cereals and grassy hosts, typically in the southern US, northern Mexico, and the Pacific Northwest and California. These uridinospores that are produced in the pustules and active infections on the growing crop are blown northward by wind currents, and they affect successive winter and spring crops as they move from the southern US into the middle part and then eventually into the prairie region. So the prairie region, the rust spores typically arrive and are most critical in June. And if we look at the spread of cereal rust into the Western Canadian region from the USA, and especially the prairie region, it really depends on source, location, disease level. So is there a rust epidemic, whether it's stem rust, leaf rust, or stripe rust, occurring in our source US areas? The other thing is that we also want to be concerned about pathotypes. So the work that we do here in Canada and the work that Dr. Chen at Washington State University in stripe rust and colleagues with the rust laboratory in Minneapolis, St. Paul and Minnesota are key in terms of staying on top of the pathotypes in the US and the implications that we may have here in the prairie region. You need movement of those rust spores from the infected crop into the upper atmosphere air parcels, movement of those air parcels from those source areas into the at-risk prairie locations, and then of course spore survival during that long distance trip. And typically rust spores are pigmented, they're thick wall, they're resistant to desiccation and radiation, so they're adapted to that long distance trip. So if we look at our source areas from the US, in terms of the prairie region, stripe rust traditionally has come up from the Pacific Northwest And those air parcels that might move over Pullman, Washington State, for example, take about a half a day to move into the Lethbridge area. So it's a very rapid potential movement of rust spores into the Prairie region. Typically, you don't see as much into eastern Saskatchewan and Manitoba from the Pacific Northwest, but they do occur on occasion. If we look at that Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska corridor, that's our main issue and source for stem rust and leaf rust traditionally, and now over the last 10 to 15 years, stripe rust. And those air parcels and trajectories mainly end up in central Saskatchewan, eastern Saskatchewan, and into the Manitoba region, but occasionally they can move up into the Western Prairie region. So if we look at the spread of cereal rust into the Prairie region, it also depends on deposition of spores over at-risk locations, and that typically requires not a lot of rainfall, but that rain can help scrub those spores out of the air and into the crop, can also contribute to humidity, leaf wetness in the crop that facilitates infection and further disease development. Crop growth stage is also a consideration for at-risk locations. And then, of course, the prevailing weather conditions in the Prairie region. So in terms of the cereal rust, they can represent a fairly unique and challenging problem for prairie farmers, as the risk is not dependent on crop rotation. So typically for the other cereal leaf spots that are residue borne, or things like Fusarium head blight, they're residue borne. So a crop rotation or the type of crop rotation a farmer follows will impact their risk. That's not the case with cereal rusks, and they typically don't overwinter in the prairies. Again, as I've mentioned previously, they survive on grass, cereal and grass hosts in various locations in the USA. There can be, as I've mentioned, potential for fall infection in winter wheat in the Prairie region. And then if that fungus survives a milder winter, it will start to develop again as the winter wheat crop develops. And work that my colleagues, Kit Kwan Shea and Krishan Kumar, have done in about 10, 12 years ago, have shown that those infected winter wheat fields are definitely an important source and a risk for adjacent spring wheat and potentially barley fields. So the Uridaneo spores are blown up from the USA, and these rust epidemics can develop quite quickly, and thus without timely scouting of these issues and timely application of fungicides, that efficacy of that fungicide that the producer is going to use can be compromised. Now, depending on the arrival of the rust, the level of host susceptibility and the rust impacts can be substantial. So we've got some work from Stephen Simpendorfer in Australia showing when the rust arrives from first node through to mid-flowering, the level of stripe rust resistance in this case. And you can see with a very susceptible variety, the earlier it arrives, the more catastrophic those yield losses can be. And similar information from Dr. G. Murray in Australia, and some of the work that Bob Hunger and Ken Jackson have done in Oklahoma, which shows the severity of leaf rust on the flag leaf at different crop growth stages and the extent of loss. What about the prairies? Well, some of the work that, again, my colleagues, Krishan Kumar and Kit Kwan Shea did, showed similar yield losses. And in general, yield losses in the range of 4 to 22% when the rust arrived at late heading versus about 11 to 91% if they arrived at the penultimate leaf emergence stage. So very catastrophic levels of yield loss when it arrives early. So if a farmer or a crop consultant working with them is not aware that there's a rust issue, it may not be on their radar. And as a consequence, depending on the frequency of scouting, it can cause some significant issues. And just to illustrate that, I've seen it firsthand over the years, over the last 25, 30 years. I got called out to a field in the Lacombe area in August of 2004 by a seed grower, actually, who had a problem in their wheat field, poor crop development, We looked at the field, and certainly there appeared to be some issues, maybe with some fertility problems, maybe a late herbicide application. But one thing the producer didn't recognize is they had a pretty severe stripe rust epidemic. So you can see the rust spores on both our boots here, and it extended up our pant legs. A couple years later, I had a call from Kelly Cooley. He's an ag fieldman, or was an ag fieldman with the MD of Pincher Creek. And he had a farmer who said, you know, I drove by the field on a Friday, so your standard 60-mile-an-hour or 100-kilometer-an-hour field inspection. Field looked good, green, but there was some rust development occurring, stripe rust development occurring. And when they went by the field on the Monday, is my understanding from what Kelly had told me, the field was starting to turn this sort of orangey yellow color. And in the end, the producer decided to not take the crop off for grain yield, but try to salvage some of it with silage harvesters. And actually, the harvesters were coated with a thick layer of stripe rust spores. So we scraped off some of those and sent me a little lunch bag that was about half to 3/4 full of your stripe rust urea spores. And we've seen other cases of these catastrophic stripe rust epidemics on very susceptible varieties. And in the worst case scenario I've seen is where producers here in Alberta have seeded a wheat as a swath grazing crop. So they actually graze livestock over the winter on swaths. So they cut the crop, windrow it, and then use electric fence to progressively graze those swaths over the winter. Typically, they plant in mid to late June. So what has happened previously, back in 2003, 4, 5, and so on, is those swath grazing fields are coming into their main vegetative phase at about the same time that the stripe rust epidemic is peaking on the spring cereal crops in Alberta. So a heads up is important. So that's the purpose of the Prairie Cereal Rust Risk reports. So since 2019, up to this summer, we've had about 7 to 10 rust reports from about mid-May to early July, depending on the year and what's happening in the US with crop development and crop maturity and harvesting and so on. So we look at the weekly occurrence of wind trajectory events for individual prairie locations, and we look at running summaries of the total number of dates with reverse trajectories based on modeling that Environment Canada does and that we're collaborating with colleagues there. So we look at rust development in the source US locations. We look at prairie weather and crop development also. And then we issue these reports. Really, the intention is not a specific and defined risk, but more of a relative risk and the need for timely, targeted in-crop scouting and risk assessment, and using tools like what Dr. Chen advises, 5% leaf area affected or 5% of the plants or leaves infected with stripe rust is sort of a threshold where you would consider fungicide when you have at least that level of disease. And then, of course, putting on a timely fungicide application. So if we look at the wind events, we look at backward trajectory events or reverse trajectories from specific locations in the US. So we have coordinates here in the Pacific Northwest, as well as that Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska corridor. We base those on some of the information from the USA in terms of the extent of wheat production, so the main winter wheat production areas. So again, from the Pacific Northwest and the Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, Nebraska regions, traditionally stripe rust has been the main issue affecting crops in the Pacific Northwest, but are we going to have potential future issues with stem rust coming out of that area of the northwestern US? And then, of course, leaf and stripe rust can affect crops in that Texas to Nebraska corridor, and usually we have limited development of stem rust. But I hear from colleagues in the USA that with susceptible varieties, they do tend to see some issues with stem rust on occasion. So in terms of the wind trajectory events, Environment Canada colleagues there, Serge Trudel is the key person. They look at 3 altitude backward trajectory models using a global environmental model, and they look at backward trajectories that follow a 5-day backward time frame. So air parcels that move over at-risk locations. So in this case here, Lethbridge is our at-risk location, and we follow it, in this case, at midnight on June 16. There's an air parcel that passes over Lethbridge. Where did it come from during the previous 5-day period? And in this case, it came up through northern Oregon, central to western Washington state, and the top part of Idaho into the Lethbridge region. And again, I won't go into detail, I've already covered it. So we look at where those air parcels have come from and assess them. Have they come through those source locations in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and Oregon and Washington state? So Environment Canada and the modeling, what we did working with Owen Olfert and Ross Weiss and Julie Soroka, as well as ourselves, is that we identified locations where Environment Canada has weather stations, and those were the at-risk locations that we have across the Prairie region. So there's about 40 of those. They do have some other ones in BC, as well as central Canada and the Maritimes. So we also look at provincial crop reports and weekly and seasonal weather conditions. So crop growth stage in May, it's really most critical for winter wheat. Spring wheat is less critical because the crop is either not planted or hasn't emerged yet. The other thing is that some seed treatments, if they are a little more mobile and they move from the seed up into those developing leaf tissues, can provide some suppression early in the season. It's really in June where our focus turns from winter wheat to spring wheat. So our main vegetatives and then transition to the reproductive phase in spring wheat. And in early June, certainly in winter wheat, we're at that head emergent stage and starting grain filling. Weather, we look at 7-day average temperature and total rainfall, and then also growing season values. So here's an example of a weekly rust risk forecast. From June 11th to 17th from 2004. We identified an elevated risk for fields in some Manitoba regions. There were a number of reverse trajectory events that originated over Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska. This blue line here that have come up through those areas and into Manitoba. Potentially bringing up rust spores during that process. There were also weather conditions that could favor uridospore deposition and host infection. So rainfall totals near Winnipeg were about 25 mils on June 15th and 16th. So just some of the other maps that we see. Here's reverse trajectories from the Pacific Northwest and Kansas, Nebraska into the Portage La Prairie area of Manitoba. So it's getting a bit of a double whammy. They're getting potential rust spores coming up from that Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska region, but also from the Pacific Northwest. And a very similar picture for Carmen, Manitoba. And these are areas where they started to pick up stripe rust in late June in 2024. And then we also had subsequent reports from Saskatchewan and in southern Alberta and central Alberta, and we could relate that back to trajectory events. One thing I want to mention is that as we get into mid-June, because of the stage of crop development in Texas and Oklahoma, they're moving into having a mature crop or even being harvested. Obviously, those areas no longer represent a significant risk in terms of a source of rust spores, so we focus more and more on Kansas and Nebraska. So if we look at our weekly wind trajectory totals, we look at the number of days during the previous 7 days that have had trajectory events. Low risk is typically where we don't see any reverse trajectories for an at-risk prairie location that have previously passed over those source US areas. If we have about 1 to 2 trajectories during that 7-day period, we have a low to moderate risk where we've had those trajectories passing over source locations, and then moderate to highs where we're getting into that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 trajectory total during the previous 7-day period. And again, we issue a sort of a summary. So this just shows you from about April 1st to June 17th, the number of trajectories from the Pacific Northwest into the Prairie region. And you can see we had some that moved into southern Saskatchewan, western Manitoba, and even into that Winnipeg area. And in terms of Kansas, Nebraska, it's mostly central Saskatchewan into Manitoba. What's the status of rust in the States? And this is where I really want to graciously acknowledge the efforts and information that we glean from colleagues like Dr. Chen and his rust updates that he issues throughout the summer. And we follow those during the fall and winter in terms of predictions for rust issues in the upcoming growing season. We follow the Cereal Rust Lab bulletins from Dr. Fajula, and sorry, I might mispronounce that, at the Cereal Disease Laboratory in Minnesota and the colleagues that work as part of that. We also look at efforts from Dr. Zawoon and previously Dr. Bob Hunger, who's retired now, in terms of Oklahoma. We then follow some of the updates from Dr. DeWolf and Dr. Anderson Onufree. Again, my apologies if I've mispronounced names. We look at the Crop Protection Network and the Ag Pest Monitor in terms of what's happening. And then we follow Dr. Wegeloo in Nebraska in terms of the updates in terms of disease and specifically in terms of rust. So in terms of our rust forecasts, we issue one separately for the Pacific Northwest, for Kansas and Nebraska. In this case, with this report, we've stopped looking at Texas and Oklahoma, but earlier in June and late July or May, we also look at Texas and Oklahoma. And we look at a summary forecast. So this is for the whole Prairie region. And there may be locations that have elevated numbers of trajectories and weather conditions that favor spore scrubbing and potential host infection. But overall, we look at the Prairie region, we look at rust development in the US, the frequency of wind trajectories that pass over those source locations, prairie weather conditions, and stage of crop development to issue these weekly rust risk reports, where we just simply say there's potential for a rust issue developing over the next 1 to 3 weeks. If you're growing susceptible varieties especially, it is recommended to actively scout those fields to identify emerging rust problems. And then we also try to monitor rust outbreaks. So we get reports from colleagues, research colleagues, extension staff with the provinces, so people like Mike Harding, Ali Reza Akavan, and previously David Kaminsky in Manitoba, and then updates from crop consultants, farmers, and so on. So with that, Reem, I'll end there. And again, I just want to emphasize that the role of the Prairie Crop Disease Monitoring Network, and specifically the cereal rust risk forecasts, is to provide a heads up in terms of areas of the prairies where there is a potential for a developing rust issue and where timely scouting and fungicide application may be needed. So I'll end there, Reem, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.